how to support and gear the implementation of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development to success. So it's my pleasure now to lead you through this keynote debate. I'm very honored for that. The issue is very dear to my heart, so I'm happy to do that. Let me introduce today's subject, transformation towards sustainable development. The necessary agenda we have at hand. Everyone is and should be concerned by this. But there are actors who are more crucial than anyone else to implement the Agenda 2030 and to reach its goals. It's science, it's policy, it's society. Let's concentrate on science and policy this afternoon. Science must deliver, policy must deliver. What this means, for instance, just for Switzerland, has been laid out just last month in a discussion paper of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Switzerland. The lead author actually was Thomas Frey. That's kind of coincidence. Well, science must deliver, and you all know what that means in the role of what the role of science is in the policy cycle. It's about system knowledge, single and multidisciplinary knowledge and technical know-how on dynamic, spatial and time-dependent processes at different scales is necessary. We need target knowledge by working with the relevant stakeholders using transdisciplinary methods in order to define the desired changes. We have to agree on them. This is very important, and we need transformational knowledge, of course. That is to say, we must develop joint pathways for implementation. And finally, science plays also a role in evaluating the effectiveness of undertaken measures. That's the role of science in policy cycle. Policy needs to deliver as well. Above all, it must ensure policy coherence. It's been said before, actually. It must ensure that law and political actions are coherent in terms of sustainable development. That requires a comprehensive view and approach on sectoral, on domestic, and on foreign policies in order to reveal contradictions and to identify synergies on the way to reach the SDGs. Now, these two actors, science and policy, both being very relevant, extremely important, they need to work together. What's the use of the best scientific information if it has no effect? If science wants to be relevant to society, it must make a leap forward in how it creates knowledge, taking into account societal demands, and in bringing its evidence to politics. If politics wants to realize its ambitious goals, it must rely upon carefully elaborated, reliable scientific evidence. So here, there is the urgent need for a continuous dialogue, for genuine partnership between science and politics. This partnership for transformation will now be at the center of today's debate. We will start by two keynote speeches, one by Esther Mwangi from Kenya and one from Esther Turnhout from the Netherlands. The two speakers will later on be joined by two additional debaters in a panel discussion in the second part. And now, very important, it's the discourse which brings us ahead. And you are all certainly here in order to contribute, to discuss, to be involved. So please interfere, bring forward your concerns and questions. For that purpose, there is available the audience interaction tool, Slido. You have seen the slide before Thomas was speaking. You can, through your laptop, mobile phone, put your questions to the audience, to the panel. The code is ICRD 2017. So now let's get started by introducing our first speaker. She's already standing there, Esther Mwangi. She is a principal scientist and hub leader at the Center for International Forestry Research in Nairobi. Her current research portfolio includes research on benefit sharing arrangements in RED schemes, how to strengthen women's tenure rights, and research into tenure reform implementation and also effects on the tenure security of local men and women. Esther works globally, including in Uganda, Tanzania, Indonesia, Peru, and Nicaragua. A citizen of Kenya, Esther has a bachelor's degree in education from Kenyatta University, a master of philosophy in environmental studies from Moi University, and a PhD in public policy from Indiana University, Bloomington. So, science policy partnership being at the center of our debate, Esther will share some specific lessons with us now for narrowing the research action gap in forested landscapes. Please, Esther, the floor is yours.
Minimize that? It's okay.
Take the new one.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference, the Center for Development Research, and of course the financiers, the Swiss National Science Foundation and the Center for the Swiss Development Corporation. About 25 years ago, this young woman completed her master's program in Kenya. You know, after spending months working on vegetation, trying to analyze vegetation, trying to establish the composition and structure of vegetation, and trying to link that to soil properties, at last she gets this job in a wildlife management organization, a rather well-reputed one in the country at the time, and also very well known internationally. So this young woman, 25 years old, maybe a little bit younger, starts working and does a lot of ecological monitoring kind of work, links up with others in the elephant program, and begins to learn about how to estimate elephant numbers and distribution from the frequency of dung counts and the condition of elephant dung. And, going forwards also, she works with others to look at not just elephant distribution, but also issues around human-elephant conflicts and what needs, trying to think through what needs to be done. Where do you put a fence based on the data that you have from, the elephant distribution and human, what people say about the frequency of conflict, the timing of conflict. So of course you do all this, but then guess what? The report ends up in a shelf. So of course there's a little bit of frustration for this young woman, and she decides, okay, maybe what I need to do now is to understand a little bit about what happens in this sphere, how decisions are made, policy decisions are made in politics. And so off she goes and starts getting a PhD around this. And then over time again, so you begin to understand how these decisions are made, but then something's still missing. And then she moves on and works with Bill Clark at Harvard and begins to understand that there's actually some theories around this issue of linking research to action. And she finds that there's also a community of practice. So the point of that was just to let you know how I came to be standing here and how I came to be interested in this work. And this work did not just start recently, or these issues around wanting to link research to, knowledge to action. These are things that have puzzled me for a long time. Initially frustrated me, but puzzled me over a long time. But what was really good joining CIFOR is that I found that colleagues at CIFOR did this. They did strive to try and make the links between research and action, research and policy, research and practice. So today, I will speak with you about some of the work that I've been doing while at this organization, and I will use one case to try and highlight what are some of the key things that I think matter for making this link between, the interaction between these different actors and why it matters, especially for bringing about change and outcomes that we want to see on the ground. So I begin by mentioning what the purpose of this presentation is. It's really about trying to share with you an approach for integrating evidence with policy and practice, and in particular, sort of like distilling what are some of the key insights that I get from this work that can be used to strengthen interactions among these different actors, researchers, practitioners, policymakers. And I begin by providing a background and motivation that's grounded in some real things going on. And then I'll talk a bit about the approach and, very importantly, share with you some of the outcomes that we've been able to see over a span of about 5 years of intervention. And then I will conclude. So the background is this. In Uganda, there is this forest policy that's very clear about integrating gender and making sure that women's tenure rights are secure, that encourages or strives to encourage active participation of women and others, that actually attempts to secure their tenure rights, and very importantly is also interested in breaking down attitudinal barriers. So this is perhaps one of the few places I've seen very explicit language. But then what happens then, in reality, besides that, what happens to that statement of intent, and how is it, in reality? And that's one of the things we tried to do in 2010 and 2011 in Uganda, because this is really impressive that you have very clear language in the policy. And so we set about trying to get an understanding of what's going on in real life. But what we found that despite, about a decade of implementation of this very progressive policy, we do find that there's still prominent gender inequalities in forest use and management. And there are very several things that pertain to the bureaucracy and how it's organized and the kind of knowledge that are within, and among people there. But also, very importantly, there are cultural norms and practices that are actually gender biased, okay? And these cultural practices do not allow women to plant trees because one of the things is that forests and trees are for men, and planting a tree is actually symbolize ownership. So what we did is we tried to implement an intervention to try and enhance participation, strengthen women's rights, but also in the process try and establish, what exactly is needed and what are the lessons. And so we took up an approach called adaptive collaborative management, which is an approach that was designed by C4 scientists who had been there way before me at C4. And so this was really, really interesting in the sense that I come in 2009 and pick up what others who had been there even a decade before had been talking about. And so we try and use this adaptive collaborative management, and I call it an approach to empowerment. It's based on voluntarism. People join groups, but it's what happens within these groups that really matters, in the sense that there is, people agree to be able to work together, to collaborate, to resolve whatever conflicts they might have and to negotiate, but it all happens under the facilitation of specialists who have been trained in the approach, okay? And the approach is really one that allows them to identify what the problem is with regards to resource management, or forest management, and also to vision where do they want to go and how should it look like in the end. And then they come up with an action plan and implement the action plan and monitor it within the community, of course, under the supervision of a community facilitator. And they monitor, they evaluate how they're doing. Of course, that's a basis for learning, and they make the adjustments they need and begin the whole process again. And so basically, this allows them to move from a situation that they basically don't like to one which they think or they agree is useful. And this is a methodology that has been tested in several countries, I think up to 6 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and has been found to be useful for improving participation in management, but has not really been used to focus on a difficult situation of trying to deal with cultural norms and biases against women's participation and rights. And so in terms of a process, what we did is we worked in several communities, in several districts in Uganda, and these are all randomly selected. And we had mixed groups of both men and women as opposed to only women. And the ACM approach allowed us to actually conduct training in the approach for the facilitators, but we did other things beyond that in terms of building capacity of both men and women in gender concepts and application. And this sort of allowed them to also debate and challenge whatever was treated as norms. We also had some training in leadership for both men and women in different technical skills that they thought were important in the forestry setting. So for example, tree planting, nursery management, beekeeping, etc. And these are the same projects that they had said they would implement in order to deal with some of the problems they felt were afflicting the community with regards to forest and forest conservation. And of course, they had community facilitators who would follow up and also organize monthly meetings. And of course, in order to monitor and evaluate, they had to develop a set of indicators. So this was all done at the community level generally with the NGOs that we had partnered with, that we were working with, and also with Makerere University, which is a research organization. It's a university and it's based in Uganda. So those were the partners we had and with whom we decided, okay, this is what we all want to do, so let's just hold hands, close our eyes, and just jump. And that's what we did. And after several years, actually, we began seeing some changes around the indicators that people had chosen themselves. And so before the ACM intervention, women's leadership was very low, and you had very few women in leadership position, especially in the executive committee of forest user groups. But that increased quite substantially after the time, We also ended up having women now owning and planting trees, including planting trees that were forbidden, like the ficus. And so all along, all the different indicators were positive, okay? And so then the question is, what is it? How do we talk about these outcomes? And I think, so that's just a schema that tries to talk about what were the conditions before, and then what were the conditions, what does ACM do over there? And it's just a summary of the different things that were happening, the training, the monitoring and evaluation, yeah. And then on this other side are some of the outcomes that we had, which included increased confidence, being able to do a lot of the work that they needed to do. And then right at the end is the actual impact, which is the amount of forest that was reforested, the number of trees that had been planted by women, by men, and also by both men and women. So I think the point here is that there was some kind of outcome, and there was an impact in terms of trees planted on farm and also trees planted in areas of degraded forest that were actually allocated to these groups. So the question is, what do we think has been driving these outcomes? And I think, what we do think is that we did invest quite a bit in capacity building, increasing knowledge, skills, and confidence of women, and which also enables them to lead the groups and also to implement these forestry and non-forestry activities on farm and off farm. I think the other thing that we thought worked very well was the vertical linkages that the NGO was able to establish, especially to the National Forest Authority, which people didn't quite like in the beginning, but by the end of it, the NFA was actually very keen to work with people on the ground, and people were also interested in the NFA. And what was very important about these external actors is that they didn't come empty-handed. They came with information, they came with technical capabilities that they shared with people, and they also supported training. In other cases, they would provide the training in beekeeping, in nursery management. They would donate seedlings and all that kind of thing. And then we also had these ACM facilitators who created a really safe space where everybody could share and could talk, but also very importantly, the kind of decision rules that were being used that allowed people to be able to share what they had. So what else? I think the other thing that we did that was a bit different from what our earlier colleagues had done is that we had engagements beyond the community level. So we did actually reach out to legislators, in Parliament in Uganda. So, for example, the Natural Resources Committee, the Parliamentary Women Association, ministers for gender, and that kind of thing. And we talked to them about what we were finding. And at least the head of the Natural Resources Committee did make some promises. So we can go back to him and ask him, hey, so what did you do and what can you do? We also talked with of course, the National Forestry Authority was part of this. They endorsed the methodology. And guess what they're doing now? They actually came back to us and said they're interested in integrating gender into community forestry guidelines. So we're helping them with that. On top of that, we had workshops with practitioners. And very importantly, we had a project advisory committee from the beginning to the end. And this committee comprised different actors. And their job was actually to keep us honest, but also to see what we were producing in terms of research, to critique it, to help us interpret it. There were our advocates and there were champions. So there were people that were on our side, and there were some of them were in the bureaucracy, in different places, and so they could also advocate for what we were doing. And so what else do we think was important here? Again, the importance of partnerships. We have been working with these different partners for a very long time. With Makerere University, we've been working, I've known our partners there for a very long time, since '97. So these are partnerships that we've had for a very long time. So we know each other, and we're able to work together and share more or less similar values when we're thinking about communities, when we're thinking about equity and that kind of thing. Now, the Forest Sector Support Program is actually in charge of implementing or monitoring implementation. And so they also did buy in to our research. And, a couple of months ago at a World Bank meeting, they actually talked very positively about the kinds of things we're doing. So we do have a rather good partnership going. So in conclusion, for us, partnerships have been very important. And, there are many different things that allow these partnerships to work. But I think also just being present, just being there, is very critical. We also think that engagement was very important in different ways, feeding back what we had to the different actors, facilitating what we needed to facilitate, providing information, but very importantly, being there, being present. I think that's half of the battle won. Just people seeing you year after year, talking to them, sharing what you have. And then, of course, I think capacity building was invaluable. And we think that these are critical things if we're thinking about transforming, if we're thinking about outcomes that are real and on the ground. Now, what's very interesting is, and I have CIFO colleagues around here, and it's really good to see my colleagues, and what is really important here is that this is actually what CIFO does. If you go to our strategy, CIFO is the Center for International Forestry Research. If you go into a strategy, which I think a bunch of them are outside here, you will find that these are the pillars of how CIFO works. Okay? In our theory of change, engagement is key. Capacity building is key. Partnerships, we place partnerships at a premium. So it's basically the way we work, and we really like it. Okay, so I think I've come to the end of my talk, and this just shows you some of the things that we do. We have videos, we write blogs, we have briefs that we share with policymakers. The briefs are pretty short, but I remember somebody looking through and saying, oh my goodness, Esther, these are 8 pages. Can we have even shorter ones? So, so it's a learning process. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Go here. Sorry for that. Thank you very much, Esther, for this very interesting talk. You not only showed us how a young woman finds her way into science, into commitment, into engagement, at the end with society, but also very down-to-earth experience. Now, unless there are no urgent questions for understanding now, no, then I suggest we continue. We will have a debate on this later on. Thank you again very much, Esther. We're coming to the second keynote speech of this afternoon. It's by another, Esther, by Esther Turnhout. She is full professor at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group of Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Her activities include research into the different roles experts play at the science policy interface, the political implications of policy relevant knowledge, and the participation of citizens in environmental knowledge making, also known as citizen science. She has published articles in numerous journals such as Nature or Environmental Politics. She is associated editor of the journal Environmental Science and Policy. She's also been selected as an expert for IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and she's actually currently a lead author in the IPBES Global Assessment. Esther is going to talk to us about democratizing development research. Please, Esther.
So thank you to the organizers for having me here. I think the Research for Development program is really quite innovative as a funding strategy, and I'm very happy to be back. So 2 years ago, in Vilsbach, I gave a talk on the role of knowledge brokers at the science policy interface and some of the challenges that they face in trying to connect research to decision making. Now today I want to do something slightly different, but also building on these insights and discussing the relation between knowledge making, particularly in a development context, and democracy. Before I do that, it is probably clear to everyone in the room that the relation between science and society is a little bit under pressure or in crisis at the moment. So increasingly anti-science rhetoric seems to be an accepted part of public and political discourse, not just in the US, but also in several European countries, including England and also the Netherlands. Now, in these discussions, several commentators have offered different interpretations of what is going on. And before I proceed with my main arguments, I want to quickly address two common responses that are, in my view, inadequate. So the first response, and the quotes that I put up here represent that response, blames society and politics and invokes an enlightenment ideal as something that we should aspire to. So these quotes here, the first one is from the president and the vice president of the Dutch Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the second one is from Sir Paul Nurse, the former president of the Royal Society. So this is eminent scientists saying that, basically blaming science and society for insufficiently respecting the authority of science. Now, the second response that I couldn't find a quote quickly enough to put up here blames individuals. Studies in psychology and cognition have repeatedly shown that people are inevitably biased in accepting information. So from this perspective, and I take this from a recent essay by Daniel Sarowitz, science denial is a behavior, and it's a consequential and not to be ignored part of society. Now, quite apart from the question of whether there's any value or truth to these responses, there might very well be, they're inappropriate and unhelpful for a number of reasons. First, they reflect an arrogant attitude on the part of science, which is not only unhelpful in trying to restore trust, but has also partly caused the problems that science currently faces. Second, it allows science to evade responsibility, and it does so by casting science as a victim of supposedly independent societal and political trends, and by putting emphasis on better communication of science so that limited individual minds might better understand and respect science. Now, all this draws attention away from what I see as more urgent problems, which are located in the way in which science produces and claims to produce policy-relevant, reliable knowledge. I will illustrate my argument using two partly fictional but inspired by my own experiences examples, one from commissioned research and one from free or fundamental research. Now take this first example. A societal actor commissions research into the financial costs of a deposit system for plastic beverage bottles. A scientific institute takes on the task, does some calculations and provides an answer, but then trouble starts. A lobby in favor of plastic recycling uses these findings and claims that deposit systems are too expensive. A controversy emerges in which advocates of deposits challenge the integrity and validity of the research done. So now this is a typical example of what has come to be known as the politicization of science, the use or rejection of research according to specific political preferences. Now, in this interpretation of what happened, the scientists were basically neutral. They were asked a question, they used their methodologies, and they came up with an objective answer. And then unwittingly, they became part of a controversy. A different interpretation, however, is that these scientists, by ignoring the political context and by accepting a narrow and unbalanced research question, ended up serving the interest of the recycling lobby and ignored other voices and perspectives. Now, a second example from biodiversity science. A group of scientists is interested in the question which forms of land use contain the highest biodiversity values. Before they can get started with their work, they need to create a conceptual framework and a methodological approach. First, they create a classification which distinguishes different forms of land use, including agriculture, nature reserves, and urban areas. Second, as a measure of biodiversity, they decide to use the Shannon-Wiener Index. And they pick a number of areas in each category and do a survey of the diversity and relative abundance of birds, flowering plants, and butterflies. The outcome of the study is that nature reserves score highest, and the environmental lobby uses this to advocate for better funding and management of protected areas. Now, in this second example, we don't see controversy or scientists being discredited, but quite similarly, we see that societal actors use research findings to further their agendas. In that sense, the examples, although in terms of institutional arrangement, are quite different, right? So you have commissioned research on the one hand and fundamental research on the other. They're also quite similar in that respect. But the role of science in this second example is rather different. Instead of answering a simple but narrow question, like in the first example, they made a number of decisions themselves to narrow down the question so that they could use their preferred and established methodologies to answer it. Biodiversity, for example, came to mean birds, flowering plants, and butterfly species. So in both cases, the politics of scientific knowledge resides not so much, or at least not only, in the use of research findings, but in their production. The main message here is that research findings can not only be used selectively, depending on specific preferences and interests, they are inevitably selective. And for improving the democratic quality of science, this selectivity must be justified. To do so, scientists must ask themselves these two important questions before they can start their work. Answering these questions will probably require some initial exploration, including getting a sense of the context of the research and the perspectives of all relevant stakeholders. Importantly, answering these questions must come with consequences. In the case of the deposit example, such reflection, for example, would have resulted in a better awareness of the ongoing political debate between recycling and deposit lobbyists and the interests of the different actors involved. On the basis of this, the researchers could have consulted with the Commissioner to open up the research to include not just financial costs, but also environmental costs, and to focus not just on the costs of deposit systems, but also on the costs of recycling. In this framing, in this limited example, all relevant perspectives could have been included in a balanced way. Of course, this is risky. The commissioner of the research was a representative of the recycling lobby, and they wanted arguments to show that deposits are expensive. Attempting to open up the research in this case might very well have resulted in the commissioner going elsewhere, and the researchers might have ended up losing this assignment. In the second example, the biodiversity example, such reflection would have implied that researchers try and get a sense of what is understood as valuable biodiversity by different relevant stakeholders, including not just the government or environmental organizations, but also citizens who live near these reserves or depend on them for their livelihoods. It would also require an understanding of land use practices beyond these fixed categories of agriculture or nature. Now, these insights would then need to be the starting point of the research. This is also risky. It might lead to the situation where established measures and methodologies fall short, where in addition to species diversity, also other measures have to be included, and also some actors might not appreciate the explicit inclusion of these other measures and the interests and views and perspectives that these reflect. Yet not doing this can no longer be an option, because it will result in either scientists uncritically serving the interests of powerful actors, as in the deposit example, or in scientists pursuing their own preferences and interests without any form of accountability, hiding the political choices involved under the banner of curiosity-driven or basic research. In each of these scenarios, science de facto contributes to technocratic closure and to science losing touch with the reality they seek to describe and improve. I put up this quote again by Dan Sarowitz from an essay that criticizes the ideal of academic freedom and autonomy, and that basically makes the same point. Now, while there are certainly cases where narrow technocratic approaches may be legitimate, this is unlikely for development research related to complex issues such as food and biodiversity. In these kinds of wicked or post-normal problems, we have to consider the interests that science serves and fails to serve, and we have to be accountable for the selectivity of our research and for the political consequences of our choices. Now, the outcome of the kinds of reflection that I propose will vary, and I cannot offer any recipes or decision trees for this. These are difficult issues where, besides scientific standards and political context, also individual integrity must play a role. I can only say that in my personal view, science should not only be more engaged, but also more politically aware. And I would add, perhaps also it could do with a bit more subversiveness, trying to be difficult and critical rather than to be effective, relevant, and usable. I mean, not all research questions actually deserve scientific input. Sometimes dominant frames need to be resisted and opened up, and sometimes science must take the side of underprivileged perspectives. Thank you.
Is there already a question regarding the understanding? I think she has been made the point very clear. Then I would rather like to invite the 4 panelists to join me in the front for a debate on this science policy partnership for transformation. Please, Farooq and the Esthers. Hallo? Jetzt ist gut, finally. Let me get organized here. So, thank you for this first round of keynotes by Esther Mwangi and Esther Turnhout. And now I'd like to introduce our 2 further panelists. First, let me introduce Hester du Plessis. So the organizers were very kind with the moderator, trying to ease his life. So we have another Hester, you pronounce it. Hester du Plessis is a chief research specialist within the Research Use and Impact Assessment Unit at the Human Sciences Research Council in Pretoria. She holds an MTech in Fine and Applied Art at the Tshwane University of Technology. In 2010, she obtained a PhD in philosophy from the University of South Africa on the role of women in design, indigenous knowledge systems, and science during technology transfer processes. Her areas of research interest include science communication, gender, a transdisciplinary approach to research, philosophy, and the philosophy of science, and the global civilizational project. Welcome, Hester. And we also welcome Farooq Ullah. Farooq actually is the executive director of the Stakeholder Forum, an international NGO advancing sustainable development through good governance and participatory decision-making at all levels. Farooq is also co-chair of the UK Stakeholders for Sustainability Development Initiative, and he is the chair of what you probably all know, the Future Earth is Engagement Committee, and beyond that, even a specialist, also advisor to UK Parliament's Environmental Audit Committee. So please give a warm welcome to all panelists for this debate. Let's start with the Agenda 2030. And the first question I think I should address to you, Farooq. To what extent do you think that the Agenda 2030 and with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals became a shared paradigm and a roadmap for science and policy partnership?
Well, thank you, Jürg, and thank you all for having me here. The SDGs are, as you know, one of my favorite topics. So it's always a pleasure to talk about them after having spent 5 years on them. I really do believe that this is a breakthrough in terms of the international community and international cooperation. The SDGs specifically, more so than the larger 2030 agenda, represent a lingua franca around sustainable development that we simply didn't have before. We can now talk in shorthand to each other around, I say 12.4, target 12.4. Somebody will know what I mean. We really haven't had this kind of systemic-based framework for understanding sustainability challenges before. Agenda 21, as good as it was back in 1992, was a big phone book. I mean, you couldn't just refer to certain elements of it in this sort of shorthand way I'm describing. And even more so, the unique thing about the SDGs, of course, is that they are global in nature and universal in application, meaning that unlike the old goals, the MDGs, these apply equally to developing and developed countries. And there is now a sort of a recognition that we are all in this together, and that this is an interconnected system, and that sort of socioeconomic aspects or activities in one part of the planet will have an impact elsewhere, and that we have to then, therefore, pursue this agenda together. With that in mind, I don't think it is, however, quite the roadmap to science policy interface that it should be, not least because the SDG process, as I'm sure you're all aware, was a politically driven process, not a scientifically driven process. Now the challenge is for science to turn this agenda, this very, very important, ambitious agenda, into something that's implementable on the ground. And the SDG agenda, the framework itself, is both very ambitious, but also very vague. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Ambition is good for obvious reasons that we all know about. The vagueness is useful in the sense that we now have to then take this step of translation and implementation down to the national and local levels. And this is where science has a clear role to play in providing that roadmap, in making those interpretations so that they are based on science and rationality and evidence as rather than just a subjective interpretation. And with that in mind, I think that we have to therefore, an element that's not really prescribed in this roadmap or this discussion, that's being alluded to by the other speakers, is that I think we need to evolve from a binary science policy interface to something more triangular, a science policy society interface, in which society has a key role, stakeholders, civil society organizations, private sector, as an interlocutor, to avoid exactly what Tatiana said, which is introducing a bias to scientific method by asking them to do the political advocacy. So we have to be careful about how do we actually do this without undermining the scientific process, but update it to be more inclusive, to be more participatory, that will have solutions that are actually there, generated by demand that people have already put into the system, and there are people waiting to use the solutions that come out of the other end.
Thank you very much. I understand you would agree that there has been an accepted paradigm shift, but you consider the SDGs rather sort of a compass to which we can, according to which we can be oriented in our actions.
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly as Tatiana said, it's a compass, but it doesn't necessarily give us this discrete roadmap that we're talking about that we now need. And I think it's for us as a community, both stakeholders and scientists, to develop those types of roadmaps. And they also need to be specifically orientated for the location in which they're based. I don't think that you can have these generic, overarching international roadmaps. You need to have things that are contextualized.
Okay, thank you very much. Though the Agenda 2030 being at the origin of what we're talking about today, now we want to dip into this research, into this partnership between science and policy. Hester to Plessis, I have to be specific. What about inclusive and effective partnerships? The exchange between science, policy, and society sounds easy, it sounds convincing, we think we should do that, but in reality, scientific evidence is just one ingredient among many for policymakers. So how do you think can collaboration between science and policy be strengthened at an early stage of research projects and the policymaking cycle? How do successful strategies in aligning the policy development process with transformational science look like?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this debate. And upon reflection about these questions and the issues that we're discussing in the next 4 days or the next 3 days after today, I really would like to flag some of the issues that comes from my own experience. I think that's always the strongest and more valuable kind of contribution one can make. And first of all, it does address what Esther next to me was saying in her presentation, and she was touching upon the ideological and political aspects that surround us in our societies. I cannot stress that big enough, and coming from Africa as a continent, we know that political instability always affects the kind of research that's taking place, but also the kind of findings are most often manipulated to serve very specific political interests. I've been working with China and India for many, many years, and again you can see the influence of the overarching political agendas in coming
to the foreground. I'm also currently working with a group of researchers from Turkey, and suddenly they are without a job. And we started to initiate a project now to look at the notion of precarity, when research is taking place outside of the scientific domain, and give some value to that research. So it does mean that you're not part of an institution, but it doesn't mean that you are without a brain or that you are not writing in your research. So we moved into that space. I also want to say that there's a conundrum that we all face, and that is to actually balance your scientific research with the policies that's current. In South Africa, we have, for instance, adopted a pro-poor policy agenda over the past 3 years now, where there's a challenge for all scientific research to bring about some changes in their domains that will bring in the factor of being pro-poor. Then most of all, I think the field of science communication is a very, very important part of all that we speak about. I listened to the previous speeches and I was thinking it should actually be a science communication conference and not development and research, because we have the different schools in science communication, like public understanding of science, science engagement, science literacy, scientific temper, scientific journalism. All of them are factors and role players in getting science out to society, but also to bring society closer to the scientists. Then, of course, I would really like to propose that the transdisciplinary approach is central to what we do. I'm not going into the history of science transdisciplinarity, but we know that there's a challenge now for the narrow interests that's being served by the specific disciplines. We sit with nearly 9,000 different disciplines, and it's becoming really a kind of an intellectual battleground. So to move beyond that is very, very important. We also have different mechanisms for policy development. We have evidence-based research, which my institution is strong on, and we produce policy briefs that actually lead to Parliament considering different aspects for other existing policies. So I'm not going to go into, I've got a few other pointers, but I think it should serve its purpose. That very, very strong message that I would like to bring across is the bigger emphasis on science communication within the new paradigm that we all allude to very often, like science and society, science in society, science for society. There's the Masters report of a few years ago that's leading that quest of bringing the worlds together in this way of communicating in a more challenging way. We have theoretical frameworks that we can actually fall back on, and we are all familiar with, from C.P. Snow's to culture debate in the 1960s to the current, more recent Mode 2 system of knowledge production. So there's a lot of theoretical frameworks that can actually help and assist us in getting to a more human-friendly policy that is actually serving not just the purpose of the specific country, but also serving the purpose of debates like the one on the Anthropocene that is current, quite an important debate, and contribute positively to that.
Thank you very much. Let's just get on. Esther, Turnhout. You were very critically before towards science. Maybe, I don't know, if the presentation of Esther Mwangi gave you some hope, because she clearly showed how science can approach these issues together with other actors. Now, there are many contextual differences. Science, policy, society interfaces are at their core social processes that include relations between actors, obviously. So how do such interfaces look like in different contexts? What are related to risks and rewards for researchers, according to you?
So I can actually only talk about the context that I know. So I'll give some examples. And that kind of illustrates not just the social nature of science policy interfaces, but also their institutional and historical character. If you look at different models, you see that they reflect specific cultures and styles of decision making, for example. So a common model that I think we all know is where science policy interfaces actually aim to create consensus knowledge to facilitate political decision making and compromise. So this is the model that is common in the Netherlands, and it's also a model that is common in the IPCC, for example. Now, my experience with this particular way of organizing a science policy interface, and particularly the role of consensus here, is that actually the truth value of knowledge is often not the most important thing. The first example I wanted to give here is EU Fisheries Policy. This is made on the basis of an expertise infrastructure that produces singular knowledge about total allowable catches of commercial fish species. Now, what is interesting about this example is that this knowledge has considerable problems, and these problems are very, very well known. So apparently, the political function of this knowledge is more important than its scientific accuracy. And in the Netherlands, we have a similar situation where macroeconomic models and projections play a hugely important role in negotiations between political parties. Also, these models are well known to be deeply problematic from a scientific point of view, yet they are very important in these negotiations. So this particular interface model could be heralded as a best practice because the relation between science and policy is extremely well organized, is very efficient, and is very smooth. It's also very beneficial for the scientists involved because there's a continued need for their knowledge, and they may also be quite certain of its relevance and use, even though they may not always like the decisions that come out of it. But they're also elitist and exclusionary. So my view is that science policy society interfaces should actually not be interfaces. They should be much more messy, much more open, much more political, and we have to find a better metaphor to reflect this than interface. So the risks of creating these other kinds of relations for scientists are obvious because they lose their audience with policymakers. But the reward, in my view, is that these might actually result in better knowledge that is not only better from a scientific point of view, but also more inclusive and legitimate.
Thank you very much. Let's go on to Esther Mwangi. We could also be almost could be considered as a practitioner coming from science, but working really in the field. Now, what about power imbalances? What did you observe in your work? A major issue in policy dialogue concerns power imbalances that tend to favor the policy side usually. So how can we deal with such imbalances? How can we ensure that partnerships between researchers, policymakers, and societal actors are more balanced or even equitable?
Is this working?
Yes,
okay.
It is.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question that's really at the core of the kind of things we do. I think one of the major sources of imbalances that is so obvious is the distribution of information, right? And in the kind of things I do, I work a lot on tenure and rights. What you find is that there is such a severe asymmetry of information. For example, you find that rights have been devolved to communities in certain places, and you go to those communities and you'll find they don't even know that they have rights of a certain kind that's actually much more than they used to have before. And guess what? Nobody's telling them, right? So I think that's really one major source. One, of the lack of information is information is power. You might have information, you might know where to be able to go to complain or you might know exactly where to go to get certain things done, but you don't because you do not have the information. So one of the things that we try to do, at least I try, and several of my colleagues in the room, we do try to make sure that whatever information we have and we have produced jointly, we try to make sure that it's open to the different actors, okay? So one of the things we do is we do a lot of feeding back, right? And we do that especially to communities. In fact, I've just come back from about 2 weeks ago from working with Nining here, who's a colleague in Indonesia, and we were out there in the islands. And what we were doing is actually providing information back to communities, information that they can use and in a ways that they can understand, okay? And so that's one of the ways that we think is really critical in trying to reduce this gap in power, among the different actors.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, time is running, and Switzerland's still a little bit slow in using Slido, but we've got a few questions, so I think we immediately skip to these questions. And I put forward the first question to Esther, because in fact Esther unfortunately has to leave a little bit earlier to catch a plane. So Christian Andres from the FIBL would like to know from you, who will fund this inception phase of the transdisciplinarity for solution-oriented research? What to put into proposal if you don't know the question?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, and so I was also given the question to reflect a little bit later on what the role of politics might be in furthering this agenda that I was putting forward here. And I think, in a way, how I see science funding develop, or at least in the Netherlands, I think there's two trends that are not very conducive to these sorts of things. And that is, first of all, the tendency to only avoid risk-free research with clear proposals where you even have to say in advance what methods you're going to use and what the outcome actually is going to be, because you have to give the article titles that you plan to write quite often already. And the second trend that is not very conducive to this is to really target research that intends to contribute to economic growth. So my plea would be this can only be possible if funders are more risky. And I'm not saying this to advocate for being irresponsible. So this plea for being more risky would have to be combined with more careful monitoring and evaluation, where actually the funders show an interest in what the researchers are doing. And I like the R4D program here because they attempt to do this. Now in the Netherlands, our Science Foundation is really not that interested. You could do something completely different once you get the funding. So trying to be more risky and trying to engage more, I think are key ingredients to this. But it's a bit of a dilemma, I agree.
I may add that your perception that it's nice how it works here, one has to remind us that there is a cooperation between the National Science Foundation and the Agency for Development and Cooperation. So when we're talking about science policy partnerships, we should also aim at partnerships on the funding side to take into account these different aspects. This obviously works satisfactorily in Switzerland, maybe not everywhere else. But I would like to go to another question. It was brought forward by Jacqueline, whoever that is. Here we go. Oh, this Jacqueline. Yeah, I didn't know which one. Her question got a few hits. Several people are interested in it. Information uptake is accelerated through social media. Filtering the verified from the non-verified content more and more is difficult. So how can science respond to that? Who would like to dare an answer? Hester, yes, please.
I would just like to add that and remind the audience that last year's word of the year was post-truth. And I think that whole debate around post-truth is actually central to your question. And how then do we really establish the authenticity of things? So I'm not going to answer. I think Farooq can jump in there.
Well, I don't know if I have an answer either, but I was going to pick up on your point, and I think that as a community, we do have a role now in this anti-truth, post-truth era that we now live in to utilize science and put it to the forefront in ways that are not only communicable, but easy to understand and easy to use. And I still haven't really seen the sort of digest or the initiative that does that very well, that synthesizes the relevant science given the current debate globally and sort of tries to sort of put the two ends together. So I think, I mean, I bounce it back to you, Esther, because I think this is very much a communications job. I mean, still, I mean, the knowledge is out there, and you know, as Esther said, there are some research questions that don't deserve scientific input, but we need to figure out a process by which we equate scientific input to the demand of the day and find a way to actually translate or communicate that to people in real time so they can utilize it. And at the moment, for me, this is still all this idea of an interface, or I would argue, yes, we need a far more functional paradigm or model or forum to do this. But how do we communicate information in a way that is verified from the outset, that we know the information that comes out of whatever source is verifiable and justifiable? And I guess I still haven't seen that platform, and I would argue that we're not probably using the internet very well as a community still to communicate amongst ourselves. And this is partially what Future Earth is set up to do, and I hope that we will be starting to do some of this work more concretely. But regardless, I think everyone needs to take a serious think about how we utilize our information, our knowledge that we produce.
Okay, talking about verification of results is one thing. The question is, how do we convey them to politics? What about the issue of relevance versus being prescriptive? I do observe that superordinate scientific bodies such as the IPCC, for instance, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for such institutions, it is a taboo to issue policy prescriptive statements. They rather try to act as honest knowledge brokers who gather, analyze, and synthesize the current knowledge. Now, with individual scientists, with individual research groups, or even specific research institutes, this is often slightly different. They often derive from their findings also specific recommendations. To what extent is this maybe undermining the credibility of science, or is it even a necessity to tell politics what you expect from them? Who would like to jump in?
I'll say
Esther.
something.
Yeah. Hester.
So, understanding this mandate of being policy relevant but not policy prescriptive, in the IPCC, this is very much a language thing. So you can't say shall or should, but you can say if certain targets, or if the ambition is to meet certain targets, then these measures are necessary, right? So in a way, it's also a bit of a trick to avoid overly prescriptive language, but nevertheless, of course, the knowledge that you produce already has political consequences and implications. So if you target your research to produce policy relevant knowledge, in a way you can't avoid being prescriptive in some sense, but then you can still avoid overly prescriptive language.
Okay, so it's not such an important issue after all.
I don't think so.
Okay,
No.
I was provocative. Yes, please.
I agree. It is very much about the language, but you know, offering policy solutions is still the goal. You can offer as many as you want. You can even recommend which one you prefer, but it's important to be concrete. But I think there's something to be said here about the process and the way these things are derived. And you know, we talk a lot about partnerships. Partnerships, much like universality, is a term that we use very fast and loose in UN circles without necessarily knowing exactly what it means, but it is the panacea for all of the world's problems. But multi-stakeholder partnerships, which are an evolving concept where people sit around the table, very much in the example of Uganda and that Esther was giving, you can find a process by which you can find policy solutions in a way that isn't prescriptive by bringing everyone to the table and, for example, using the idea of reaching consensus rather than a simple majority on what that solution is. That might create much better buy-in, and you avoid any kind of prescription in that way, because it is what, if the process is designed well, the entirety of the stakeholder audience that is relevant to this topic is saying is necessary as a policy solution.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, being aware that Esther Turnhout has to run away soon, I put forward your last question to you. What would be your top 3 priority measurements to strengthen the science policy partnership for transformation from the perspective of politics now?
Yeah, so I addressed this already in my answer to the previous question. So I talked about being more risky, but also being more engaged as funders of scientific research. And this includes, of course, the political domain. They fund research, they decide on the strategic programs that they want to fund, and they can change their strategies.
Okay, and one last overall message you would like to convey before I have to run away?
No, don't think so.
Okay, thank you very much. Please give her a warm applause. We have again a question. Well, we brought it forward. It has received quite a high mark. Some donors dismiss capacity building due to the difficulty of its measurement. How to overcome their tangible output bias?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What's tangible output bias? Does anyone understand that?
You go ahead. Esther?
Maybe I can jump in here to speak about the generation of data. And it is beginning to look like a big problem. We trust data. We somehow like to know that so many % of the population is doing this or that. But if you start to compare these data sets with each other, you start to realize there's big discrepancies. And the discrepancies occur on the ground level, on the basis of the kind of questions that's being asked. Kind of questions, again, are being led either ideologically, politically, or just plain stupidity. Where you ask people in Africa questions to measure their scientific literacy, you ask questions such as scientific basis of is the Earth round or not? I mean, really, in today's age, to ask people like that and then build up the Eurobarometer percentages where people just don't know things or know so much that they feel that it's a kind of insult. To ask questions about nuclear science to the community that lives in deep rural areas, of course the result will be they are highly ignorant or just plain stupid. So we have this whole world that we work in, and efforts to now maybe level the playing ground in the data sets. I know the Agenda 2030 is now looking at the African data that's being generated across the continent to kind of find some middle way to compare all those data sets with each other, which again is a dicey thing to do because it's becoming then manipulative. So that's just my...
Thank you. Esther, I have now a question for you as well.
Okay, I thought I'd contribute to that a little.
Okay.
Maybe I didn't understand what the question was, but we view capacity building as something very interesting and really important. And we do try to do this in different ways, especially at the level of the community, but also at the level of policymakers. So, for example, one of the things that we've been doing a lot, actually, I have been doing a lot, is, because of the gender gap and the gender bias, right? I think one of the things that I've been doing a lot is working with policymakers and actually talking to them, introducing to them some of these issues, because one of the problems in the bureaucracy is that they don't even know what is gender? How do you integrate gender? So there is a gap in skills and in knowledge around gender issues and around integrating gender issues, regardless of what the policy says. Or I showed you what the forest policy says. So for me, I'm going to interpret this question in a very simple way. I'm a very simple person, maybe not as sophisticated, but we do see a value for this, especially given the knowledge and skills gap that has made it very difficult for parts of the bureaucracy to actually implement a mandate that they have.
Okay. You have in your presentation nicely demonstrated how science can collaborate with society with this adaptive collaborative management approach. Still there is a question came from someone who would like to know a little bit more. How difficult did you find the engagement in community, and what instruments can be used to foster people participation? So it's about getting a little bit more insight why this really worked, what you did.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Any kind of participation does require support of certain things. So one of the, for anyone to participate in anything, there needs to be some clear benefits that they're getting out of this, right? And that's part of, half the issue gone. So for example, we went into the communities, and what we wanted to focus on is, you don't go in and tell them, oh, actually, we've just found out the women are so oppressed here, and we've come to actually solve that problem. No, you really do have to have an entry point that makes sense for everybody in the community, okay? But, and so, for example, if it is resource degradation, if it is forest degradation, if it is the lack of alternatives to harvesting forest products, then those are the things that you really need to focus on. And in the process, so you need to find a way of buying into the interest. And one of those ways is showing what benefits they're going to get out of this. And I give you an example. So they were interested in conserving forests and reducing harvesting of forest products. So one of the things that they thought would be useful for this is actually introducing certain things that will enable them to continue their livelihood. So for example, beekeeping, and other, taking care of seedlings and setting up tree nurseries and selling those. So there has to be a clear benefit for people to be able to participate, but there also needs to be some rules around who's going to do what, right? Because it's a collective effort, and so there needs to be a way of making sure that different people contribute, and if they don't contribute, then would there be a set of sanctions? What happens? So it's pretty much. I've had people talking about theory. I think if you go to collective action theory, you should be able to get some answers around how people, what is it that actually fosters participation, what incentivizes participation. So I think it's not new.
Thank you very much. So I was advised to be pretty sharp in time, so I unfortunately have to start already the final round. Farooq, same question as I put forward before to Esther, but from the perspective of a societal actor as an NGO, what do you think from that perspective would be your top 3 recommendations, top priorities for measures to enhance the science policy partnership?
Well, first, I think we have to nail down this paradigm of inclusive science. We've been biting at this particular cherry for a number of years. There's plenty of thinking about both the real and perceived benefits and threats of this. It needs to be properly nailed down, and we need to start evolving the scientific method. That links to the second recommendation, which is that we as a community, jumping back to the earlier point around fundraising, we need to now influence the funders themselves, the funding landscape, to favor these types of things. what in Future Earth we affectionately call the COEXs. Co-design, co-production, and co-dissemination of knowledge. That needs to be built into the funding proposal so that funders favor those proposals that come based on this concept of more inclusive participatory science and knowledge generation. That's the second thing. The third thing is, I think that we need a new shared and common purpose for humanity. Apparently, the survival of our own species and other species is not enough. We need something bigger than that. And I think we should aim to get ourselves into the cosmos by 2050. And using all the scientific initiative and drive that we have behind us, doing it in a collaborative way, a new space race for the 21st century, which is collaborative, not competitive, which space agencies, scientific organizations work together. It's open source so that everybody, if there's a particular engineering problem, we can sort of try to solve it in a very global, open way. And that all of these technologies, solutions, science, and engineering that's created to make us live on, say, the moon by 2030 and Mars by 2050 is harvested in real time and given to the population to make us sustainable now on Earth as well as into space.
Thank you very much. Esther, Mwangi, maybe the same question to you. You have already made quite an elaborated demonstration, but still, what do you think are the three messages to take home from the perspective of the individual scientists now? What do you think are the most important measures from his perspective to improve science policy partnership for transformation?
Well, it's a difficult question, but I'm going to say what I think. I think that there's several things, and you've asked me for three. I think one of the things that scientists need to be, I think it's just relaxing and being able to talk about what you do, right? In quite a number of cases, I've stepped back and said, oh my God, I cannot talk about this. I have to wait until I analyze the data. Then I should be able to give you what it is that you need. Policy doesn't work that way. They're not going to wait. And so you should be able to bring whatever, you're an authority. You've gone out there, you've done the interviews, you've basically done a lot of work. And so you should be able to at least talk about what it is that you're seeing and communicate that even as you're analyzing the data. And I think that's really, really critical, because we fail to influence certain things when we have an opportunity, because we're thinking, oh my God, I have to go analyze the data and write the paper. But no, I think you should be able to take that risk and be able to talk about what you're doing. I think the other thing is that for me, it used to be extremely frustrating, because now you're expected to do the science and then to do the links and so it really takes a lot out of you. And so it seems to me that one of the things that really needs to happen is a benchmark around science and publication in high impact journals. I think it's really critical that gets re-examined, and other kinds of products that we're spending a lot of time producing really need to be brought into this portfolio of things that are going to be used to assess Esther's, to assess my work. I think there's a lot that I can I can talk a lot about, but I'll just say one last thing. And I think the importance of feedback and feeding back what it is that you're finding right back to the communities where you collected the data from. I think that's really critical. And it also legitimates whoever it is that you are in the eyes of the community. Thanks.
Thank you very much for these clear statements. And, well, the final question goes to you as well, this time from yet another perspective. We didn't talk so far much about scientific institutions, the institutional aspect. How should, from the perspective of a dean, of a director of a research institute, of a rector, what, from the scientific institutional point of view, would be the key measures to undertake? Being aware that institutions have different setting, they can influence framework conditions of all their research in their universities in a much different way than individual scientists.
I've really been pondering about this institutional, and as you know, that I'm working now with groups outside of institutions where knowledge is also being generated. And I think in the end, my main idea and message I would like to share is that one should always question and challenge the stronghold that these institutions might have on your ideas, and try to keep your ideas as uncontaminated as possible. It is possible to do research without funding. You might not have a lot of money in your pocket, but the idea could actually reign supreme in what you do. It's often called blue sky research, and in the institutions there's not much support for blue sky research, but you might find institutions that will actually value that kind of thing. The other thing is to always challenge the bureaucracies. I really like to work outside of the bureaucratic system. We often refer to ourselves in my institution as research prostitutes, because we do it for the money, and I think it's very bad. You know, whoever funds you is actually regulating what you do and what your research is all about. So one should also try to challenge that whole stronghold in the institutions. And then finally, the institutions tend to value research that's generated institutionally. I would like to pose that never underestimate the value and the knowledge of the indigenous communities in society. They know a lot, they survive, they actually work the ground, they do things that are really valuable. And we tend to go there, and I've been witness to lots of efforts where people will go from, international groups will go and teach local people how to do something, without first looking at whether they are doing something, and what does it look like, and what are the ground products that's available in that area. So don't go and train people to do pottery in Mozambique where the soil is bad. There's no ground products for pottery. So they depend on imported sand and soil to do their work. So many examples exist like that. So basically, try to identify these wicked problems, try to think outside of the box, even if you're in an institution. I think is the only way that we can really progress into the production of new knowledge.
Thank you very much. Looking on my watch, I do have to obey the organizers and come to a closing. I do sincerely hope that you found this an interesting and inspiring entry into this debate. If not, please interfere more today and tomorrow and the day after. If you did find it interesting, then give please a warm applause to our panelists. So we probably all agree that transformation for sustainable development and the reaching of the sustainable development goals is of utmost importance, not only for the future of our societies worldwide, but for the planet within its boundaries as such. Science policy partnership plays a crucial role in achieving these goals. I think we have seen that very clearly. The professional honor as scientists, I may say, includes to act in a responsible way and ethically coherent. The same is, of course, true for politics and all the other actors. Thus, a strong commitment to continuous dialogue with politics, I think, must be considered as integral part of our ethically and societally responsible research. Only then science lives up to the well-justified expectations of our society. Amen. And with this, I invite you, in the name of the conference organizers, to light refreshment outside, and I wish you a fruitful, inspiring other 3 days here in Bern and in Switzerland. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Thank you again.
Thank you.